"Get these two delivery guys out of here." Those words cut through the wedding hall. A $450,000 celebration for my son. The very moment I walked in, holding my wife's hand, I froze. The one who gave the order was the same boy I had raised for 30 years. He didn't look at me like a father. He looked at me like a stain, something that needed to be wiped away, right in front of his wealthy in-laws. In that instant, I understood a painful contradiction. My simple life, the way I had always lived, had become the very thing he was ashamed of. Before I tell you what happened later that night, if you're listening to this story, take a moment to subscribe to the channel and leave a comment telling me where you're listening from. Because right after that moment, as I stood there in the middle of the wedding hall, still gripping my wife's hand, I began to realize something. That silence didn't belong to me alone. It was the beginning of everything that came after. After that sentence, the vast wedding hall suddenly felt small. The music kept playing. The lights still shone on expensive suits. But to me, everything around us had frozen. I didn't ask him to repeat it. I didn't need confirmation. Tyler's eyes said it all. He stared straight at me, unblinking, like this moment had been rehearsed long ago. This wasn't impulse. It was a decision. I tightened my grip on Margaret's hand. Just a little. Her hand was cold. She didn't say a word. She only lowered her head slightly, the way she always does when she doesn't want to make anyone uncomfortable. I used to think that was kindness. In that moment, I realized it was also the habit of people who've spent their lives stepping back so others can step forward. Security walked over. They weren't rough. They were just doing their job. I nodded, signaling that we'd leave on our own. I didn't want to turn this night into a scene. Tyler turned away quickly, as if he was afraid someone might catch his eyes if he faced me for more than a few seconds. Chloe was different. She looked us up and down. Her gaze lingered on my worn-out shoes. Then she leaned toward her friends and whispered something. A small laugh slipped out, just loud enough for me to hear. We stepped into the hallway. It was quieter there. I looked through the large glass windows toward Lake Michigan. The water was dark, still, reflecting the lights from the high-rise buildings. I had spent my life under old cars, hands soaked in grease, my back bending a little more each year. I never thought I'd be standing outside a place like this one day, treated like someone who didn't belong. By my own son. Margaret asked softly if I was okay. I said yes. It was the same answer I'd used for years. When I worked extra night shifts, when I sold my first classic truck to pay tuition, when Tyler said he didn't want my trade, that he wanted something bigger, I always said I was fine, and I always found a way. As we were getting ready to leave, something fell to the floor near my feet. A thin stack of papers, loosely clipped together. I bent down and picked it up. No one noticed. There was no name on the cover, just a few numbers and a blue ink mark. I didn't open it right away. I slipped it into my jacket pocket, an old work instinct kicking in. When you find something that isn't yours, don't jump to conclusions. We walked slowly toward the elevator. Margaret asked if I wanted to go home. I looked back at the wedding hall one last time. Tyler was smiling, holding up a glass, standing among the people he wanted to impress. And suddenly I remembered the first time I taught him how to hold a wrench. He was 10 years old. His hands were shaking. I stood behind him, adjusted each finger. I told him if you do it right, the engine will run smooth. If you rush it, it'll fight back. I don't know if he remembers that. Inside the elevator, Margaret leaned gently against my shoulder. She didn't cry. She just let out a quiet sigh. I knew what she was thinking. She was wondering what she had done wrong. I was used to that. When the elevator doors closed, I opened the papers. Just a quick glance at the first few lines was enough. The numbers, the clauses, and a familiar name, written as if it had been replaced. Lies, laid out neatly. I folded the papers back up. I didn't feel angry the way people usually expect. There was no explosion, just a heavy, deep feeling, like realizing an engine has been worn down for years, and tonight it finally made its last sound. I knew I needed time, and I knew I couldn't handle this with emotion. We reached the parking garage. My old pickup sat in the corner, surrounded by polished cars. I opened the door for Margaret. She turned and looked at the building one more time, then shook her head. I started the engine. It ran steady. That familiar sound calmed me. That night, as the truck rolled out of the parking lot, I didn't look back. I didn't know what I would do next. But I knew one thing for certain. That sentence in the wedding hall didn't just shut a door on Margaret and me. It opened a truth, one I could no longer ignore. And from that moment on, I was no longer the father who stood still and said, "I'm fine." That night I didn't sleep, not because of anger, but because the numbers in that stack of papers kept appearing every time I closed my eyes. I spread them out on the kitchen table, under the familiar yellow light. Margaret made me a cup of tea, set it down, then quietly sat across from me. She didn't ask anything. She knew that when I go silent like that, I'm checking every detail. I read, slowly. Not because it was hard to understand, but because I wanted to be sure I wasn't missing a single thing. It was an agreement, carefully written, using words that sounded very proper. A neatly arranged story about the sole heir to a large estate. That person was Tyler, and the one who had passed away in that story was me. I rested my hand on the table. Margaret looked at me, and I saw her expression change. She read a few lines, then gently shook her head. I told her this wasn't a misunderstanding. The signatures at the bottom weren't mine, but they were close, too close. I recognized that style. I had taught Tyler how to sign his name when he opened his first account. I thought it was just a small skill back then. Turns out, he remembered it very well. I kept turning the pages. There was a section about collateral, the old house in the suburbs, the one where Margaret plants roses every spring, where Tyler grew up. That house had been used as security. The signing date was clearly listed. I remembered that day. Tyler said he was tied up in meetings. I couldn't stop by. I believed him. Margaret placed her hand over mine. She asked if I wanted to call him. I shook my head. I was used to fixing mistakes by talking things through. This time was different. This wasn't a careless word. This was a plan. I gathered the papers and slipped them into a hard folder. I knew what I had to do next. Not right then. Not in the middle of emotion. I needed to do it the way I've done things my whole life. Step by step. Precise. Without letting feelings throw me off course. The next morning I called the legal assistant who'd worked with me for many years. His voice on the other end was calm as always. I didn't explain much. I just said it was time to activate the exit plan. He went quiet for a few seconds, then asked if I was sure. I told him I had never been more certain. That plan wasn't created for today. It had been there for a long time, like a final layer of protection. I had hoped I'd never have to use it. But every asset Tyler had been authorized to manage fell under its scope. The terms were clear. If the appointed party violated basic ethical standards, the control would automatically be revoked. While waiting for the process to begin, I reviewed the security footage from the wedding venue. I didn't need permission. The operator had worked with my company for years. I asked for a short clip, right at the moment we entered the hall. I watched it again, not to hurt myself further, but to be sure my memory wasn't playing tricks on me. It was all there. That sentence, that look, nothing left to explain. Margaret asked if I planned to go back to the wedding. I looked at her. I understood what she was worried about. She was afraid things would turn loud, messy. I told her I wasn't going back to cause trouble. I was going back to finish something that had gone on for far too long. That evening we returned to the building. Not through a side door. Not in our old clothes. I had rented a suit that fit. Margaret had too. We didn't become different people. We just stopped letting appearances tell our story for us. We were ushered in as guests of the venue's sponsoring partner. No one asked questions. In that space, titles carried more weight than faces. I walked slowly, observing. Tyler was laughing, talking with a few men I recognized immediately. They were people who used to report directly to me. I watched the way Tyler nodded, the way he tried to look informed. He didn't know the stories he was telling. Had once been approved by my signature. Chloe appeared, a glass in her hand, her eyes always scanning for people who mattered. When she saw us, her gaze lingered. I recognized that familiar calculation. She walked over with a practiced smile, introduced herself, asked where we were from. I answered briefly. I didn't lie. I just didn't say everything. As that happened, my phone vibrated softly in my jacket pocket. A short message from the legal assistant. The first steps were complete. Several accounts had been frozen. No one had noticed yet. No one had felt it. But the current had begun to change. I looked around the hall one more time. The lights, the laughter, the congratulations. Everything was still running as usual. And that was what made the truth about to surface feel heavier. I knew that when the moment came, there would be no shouting, only silence. And sometimes, silence is the one thing people can't escape. I didn't need to rush anything. When you've spent your life fixing complex machines, you learn this. Change one small gear, and the whole system adjusts on its own. I stood at the edge of the party, listening, watching, letting everyone keep believing the story they wanted to believe. Tyler walked past us twice. The first time, he didn't notice. The second time, his eyes lingered just a beat longer, like something felt familiar, but he couldn't quite name it. I turned my face away, not to avoid him, but because I didn't want to break that fragile balance too soon. Margaret stood beside me, back straight, her hand resting lightly on my arm. I could feel her breathing. She was calmer than I expected, maybe because she's been with me long enough to know. When I go this quiet, everything is already arranged. We were invited to sit at a table near the stage. A middle-aged man struck up a conversation asking about my line of work. I answered briefly, sticking to the basics. He nodded, seemingly satisfied. I realized he was from the bride's family. His eyes weren't searching. They were evaluating. And in that look, I saw something Tyler had never understood. In places like this, truth always matters more than appearance. Chloe showed up again, this time closer. She asked Margaret about the bracelet she was wearing. Margaret smiled and said it was an old gift. Chloe nodded, but I caught the flicker of disappointment. She was looking for a label to pin on us, and when she couldn't find one, she looked unsettled. Just then, my phone vibrated again. Another notification. A short confirmation. I didn't need to read it closely. I knew what it meant. Another door had just closed. Somewhere Tyler couldn't see. The music shifted. The host announced the main part of the ceremony was about to begin. Tyler was invited up to the stage to speak. I watched him walk up. Back straight confidence in his smile. I'd seen him like that before. Back when he was a kid standing in front of his class. Back then I felt proud. Now I just observed. Tyler started talking about his journey, about hardship, about what he called his legacy. The words were polished, carefully chosen. I recognized a few lines that had clearly been rehearsed. He spoke about family, but never said our names. I wasn't surprised. I simply noted it. When he reached the financial part, his voice grew firmer. He talked about stability, about the future. I saw a few people nod. I nodded too. Not in agreement, but to acknowledge that the story was well told. It was just built on foundations that no longer existed. I leaned in and quietly told Margaret that it was about to happen. She squeezed my hand. I felt the tension, but there was no fear, only waiting. The large screen behind the stage lit up. At first, no one paid attention. They assumed it was just the next presentation. I watched Tyler. He kept speaking. Then, the image changed. Not wedding photos. Not staged memories. It was the video from the lobby, a few hours earlier. The sound wasn't loud, but it was clear enough. That sentence played again. No explanation needed. No captions required. I saw Chloe turn toward Tyler. I saw faces from the bride's family change. Tyler stopped mid-sentence. The smile on his face didn't fade. It froze. The room fell silent. A thick silence. One no one wanted to break. I stood up. No one stopped me. I walked onto the stage. I didn't need a long introduction. I simply said, I was the man in the video. I spoke slowly, making sure everyone could follow. I didn't scold. I didn't list my sacrifices. I talked about signed agreements, about delegated authority, about violations. I said that from that moment on, all financial control connected to Tyler had been revoked. I didn't use harsh words. Those who understood, understood. A notification appeared on the phones of several event organizers. I saw them exchange looks. I knew payments were being declined. There was no shouting, just hurried glances and whispers cut short. The bride's family stood up. The man who had spoken with me earlier looked directly at Tyler. He didn't ask for more details. He said that based on what they had just seen, his family could not continue. The statement was brief, clear, no room for argument. Tyler looked at me. This time he looked the way a child looks at his father, when he realizes He's gone too far. But I didn't step forward. I stayed where I was. I had done my part. When I turned back toward the table, Margaret stood up with me. We didn't wait for the ceremony to end. We left in silence. Behind us, I knew everything was collapsing. Not loudly, but irreversibly. And I knew this was only the beginning of the ending Tyler would have to face. We hadn't even made it out of the hallway when a voice called out behind us. Not loud, not panicked. Just urgent enough to break the silence I was holding on to. I didn't turn around right away. I let a few seconds pass, the way I always do, before tightening a bolt that's near its limit. Rush it, and everything slips. Tyler appeared at the far end of the hallway. His suit was still neat, but his face had lost its balance. He walked faster than necessary, then stopped a few steps from me. I could see his hands trembling slightly. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. The first sentence wouldn't come out. Margaret stood beside me. She didn't step forward. She didn't step back. She just stood there, a quiet anchor. I turned to face him, not to confront him, but to close a circle that had been open for a very long time. Tyler said everything had been misunderstood. He talked about pressure, about expectations, about keeping up appearances. I listened to it all. I didn't interrupt. Those arguments sounded familiar. I'd used them myself, every time I missed a family evening because of work. But between responsibility and choice, there's always a line. Tyler had crossed that line long before tonight began. I asked him one question. Just one. Did you think about your mom? Tyler went silent. His eyes flicked toward Margaret, then turned away. I didn't need another answer. That silence said enough. My phone vibrated again. One last notification from the bank. The remaining expenses for the ceremony had been fully declined. Not because anyone forced it, but because the guarantees were no longer valid. The system was simply doing its job. From inside the hall, I could hear the murmurs growing louder. Organizers started moving. Staff whispered to each other. I knew that from this point on, things would move fast. Not by the script Tyler had prepared, but by a different sequence, a colder one. A representative from the bride's family stepped into the hallway. He looked at me and gave a slight nod. No warmth, just respect between people who understand the rules. He turned to Tyler and stated clearly that the engagement would not continue. No further explanation was needed. Too much had already been revealed, to too many people. Chloe appeared behind Tyler. Her face had gone pale. She didn't look at me. She looked at Tyler, as if waiting for an explanation that could still save something. But Tyler had nothing left to offer. The stories were used up. The promises had lost their value. Chloe said one short sentence, just loud enough for me to hear. It wasn't aimed at me. It was aimed at Tyler. She turned and walked away quickly, without looking back. Her wedding dress dragged along the floor, and no one stepped in to fix it. In that moment, all the glamour turned heavy. Tyler turned to me again. This time, he didn't try to justify himself. He lowered his head, not deeply, but enough for me to see the collapse inside him. He said he was sorry. His voice was small now, unsteady. I heard it. I acknowledged it, but I didn't answer right away. I told him that what I did tonight wasn't meant to humiliate him. I told him I had tried to protect him by staying silent for too long, and that silence had made him believe everything could be covered up. I spoke slowly, one sentence at a time, the way I've always taught a new apprentice. I reached into my jacket and took out the old key to the suburban house. I placed it in Tyler's hand. I told him the house was no longer being used as collateral, not because I was going easy on him, but because I didn't want Margaret living in a place that had been used as a bargaining chip. I told him that from now on, he would have to stand on his own feet, without leaning on things he never truly valued. Tyler dropped to his knees. The hallway was wide enough for everyone to see. I didn't step back. I didn't step forward. I let him stay there, not as punishment, but as a reality he had to face himself. I said nothing more. There were no words needed then. Margaret gently touched my hand, a familiar signal. I nodded. We turned away. No one stopped us. No one called after us. The people left behind were busy sorting through the wreckage, something they never expected just a few hours earlier. When the elevator doors closed, I finally let out a long breath. Not full relief, but the end of a tension that had stretched on for years. I looked at Margaret. She looked back at me. Her eyes were tired, but calm. No tears. Just acceptance. Our old pickup waited downstairs. I opened the door for Margaret. When the engine started, that familiar sound returned. Steady. Unshowy. I drove away from the high-rise. In the rearview mirror, the lights behind us grew smaller. I knew that. From that moment on, everything had been set back where it belonged. Not through noise, not through revenge, but through decisions that had waited far too long to be made. And sometimes, that's the only way to close a story that went wrong from the very beginning. We didn't say a word as we drove out of the city. I followed a familiar route, even though I hadn't taken it at this hour in years. Margaret leaned back in her seat, looking out the window. Streetlights passed by slowly, steadily. I realized that once the loud noises were left behind, the silence wasn't heavy anymore. It returned to what it was meant to be. Peaceful. I turned onto the small road leading back to the suburbs. Everything there was the same. Low houses, trees lining the sidewalks, warm yellow porch lights. I pulled over in front of our old burger place. The sign was worn, the letters faded. We used to stop there on late nights, when work ran longer than expected. When Tyler was little, he'd fall asleep in the back seat. The smell of grease clung to my clothes, and Margaret would laugh because a napkin had stuck to my hair. We ordered the usual. No need to look at the menu. The man at the counter recognized us, gave a small nod like greeting people who had always been there. I took the tray and found a table near the window. Margaret sat down first. She took off her bracelet and placed it gently on the table, as if setting aside a long day. We ate slowly, not because we were tired, but because there was no reason to rush anymore. Margaret asked if I felt okay. I thought for a moment, then nodded. Okay doesn't mean complete relief. Okay means knowing you did what needed to be done, even when it wasn't pleasant. I told her that some things should have ended long ago. We had just chosen to endure a little longer. Margaret smiled, a tired smile, but a real one. She said she wasn't angry at Tyler the way people might think. She was just sad that he had learned to be ashamed of where he came from. I looked at her and nodded. I understood. Some sadness doesn't need someone to blame, but it still needs to be acknowledged. When we left the diner, it was late. I drove slower, not because the road was empty, but because I wanted to stretch this feeling. An ordinary evening, after an extraordinary day. When we got home, Margaret opened the front door. The familiar smell rushed out. I turned on the lights. The living room filled evenly with warmth. Everything was where it belonged. Nothing needed to be proven. I set the car keys on the table. At that moment, my phone vibrated. A message from Tyler. Not long. He said he understood, and that he needed time. I read it, then placed the phone face down. I didn't reply right away, not out of anger, but because some answers shouldn't come too soon. I believe that, if he truly understands, he'll find a way to stand on his own, without me clearing the path. Margaret hung up her coat. She asked if I wanted to take a short walk around the neighborhood. I agreed. We stepped out onto the porch. The air was cool. The moon hung low. The houses were quiet. I realized that for years I had chased big accomplishments and forgotten the value of consistency. The footsteps beside me right now, those were what had kept me standing when everything else changed. We took a short loop, then went back inside. Margaret made tea. I sat down and looked up at the old photo on the wall. Tyler as a child, dirty hands, a wide smile. I didn't take the photo down. I didn't change its place. Those memories are still true. They just don't get to decide everything anymore. Before going to bed, I checked the locks. An old habit. I paused for a moment, listening to the house. Quiet. I thought about what had happened. Not to punish myself, but to close it. Some endings don't need promises. They don't need compromise. They just need to be put in the right place. When I turned off the lights, Margaret held my hand. I held hers back. No more words. And in that silence, I finally understood something it took me many years to accept. Real wealth isn't in what you display in a single day. It's in being able to come home, sit down, and still be yourself. No hiding. No permission needed. My story ends here. Thank you truly for staying until this moment. If this story made you think, please subscribe to the channel, like, and share, so stories like this can reach more people. Don't do it for me. Do it for those who are quietly enduring in their families, the way I once did. The lesson I learned is simple. Money can open big doors, but only respect keeps a family standing. Never be ashamed of where you come from, and never trade the people who sacrificed their whole lives for you just to buy a single day of shine. If you've ever stood between protecting someone else's image and protecting your own self-respect, you'll understand why I chose this path. And if one day the child you love most turns their back because of money, what would you do? Share your thoughts in the comments. Thank you for listening to my story.